Welcome to Beyond Four Walls, Conversations on Affordable Housing. I'm David Dworkin, President and CEO of the National Housing Conference, the nation's oldest and broadest affordable housing coalition. Here, we'll dig deep into the pressing topics of housing in America. And while we do that, we'll also get to know some of the people who've devoted their lives to seeking tangible, impactful, and achievable solutions. In today's episode, we welcome industry stakeholders who engaged in a panel about the current challenges within the multifamily housing realm at NHC's 2023 Solutions for Affordable Housing convening on December 7th. What follows is a condensed version of this discussion, with the complete conversation available for viewing at nhc.org.
I'm Megan Booth. I'm the Associate Vice President for Commercial and Multifamily Real Estate at the Mortgage Bankers Association. I'm going to briefly introduce our panel, who I think most of you probably know. Sharon Wilson-Gino is the president of NMHC. She's a 30-year veteran of the housing industry and has helped guide numerous nonprofits and government entities around housing affordability, community development, and other housing policy challenges. Next to Sharon is Andrea Poser. She's the president and CEO of Stewards of Affordable Housing for the Future. She works to identify and develop and advocate for key strategic issues of concern to SAHF and its members to create a level playing field for effective, mission-oriented nonprofit business and to amplify SAHF's impact to create more sustainable properties and communities and improve the lives of residents. Ken Bacon is the co-founder and managing partner of Realfield Realty Partners, an entrepreneurially run financial advisory and asset management firm focused on the multifamily sector, started in 2013. Shakar Narasimhan, is the managing partner at Beacon Advisors, which provides strategic advisory services to companies and investors involved in real estate, mortgage finance, affordable housing, and related sectors. So during COVID, a lot of priority was placed on housing as something that's critical to keeping people safe and healthy. And there are a couple different things that came out of that. One of them was eviction prevention and diversion efforts. And so they were really ramped up during COVID, and they sort of started to ramp down, but in some places are still moving on. So I think this led to a lot more discussions of rent control and rent pricing controls around the country. So Sharon, sort of where are we now, and what sort of alternatives are there to rent control?
Unfortunately, the idea of rent control has gained additional political speed coming out of COVID, largely because people are hurting. And I think every property owner and operator understands that, communities understand that. And it appears on the surface, and particularly to politicians that haven't spent a lot of time in the housing space, that that's an easy button solution. A constituent has this problem, I can fix it through rent control and move on. Unfortunately, the data has shown us, not just recent data, but data over decades, data in the United States, data in countries around the world, that rent control actually hurts renters. And that's the conversation we need to start having with people and explaining that what we really need to create more affordability is housing supply, and how rent control efforts really hurt that supply chain for options in communities today that are hurting, but also thinking in the future and communities of tomorrow. Our population in this country is going to continue to grow at a fairly incremental rate over the coming decades. We need to be planning for putting housing in communities and creating enough options for people so they can have those choices today, but also tomorrow as well. There is no easy solution to the current concerns a lot of people have, although there's a lot of things that can be done around increasing housing subsidy, emergency assistance, rental counseling, and eviction prevention, all things that our organization supports.
One of the things that sort of came out of COVID was also some more help for residents when they're going through a hard time. So landlord-tenant mediation programs, right to counsel for tenants in an eviction. Do you want to talk a little bit about how this is working in the marketplace today, what we're seeing in different communities?
This is about as important and as passionate a subject as you can get, particularly at a time like this when essentially all the different lifelines that were extended during COVID are over. ERA, the emergency rental assistance, the eviction moratorium. So whatever your views on any of that, during that 2-year period of COVID, I happened to end up as chair of the Virginia Housing Finance Agency, which is really the primary agency in Virginia on housing issues broadly, beyond just finance. And what was the most fascinating thing was that first and foremost, we could not, in the state of Virginia, identify how many renters we had, how many were living in affordable. We knew what we had financed, but we did not actually know how to contact renters. We actually solved a lot of those data problems. But while we were solving it, we realized that the underlying issue was how did we talk to renters during the middle of a crisis, contactless, with a trusted intermediary, and actually start talking to them about what assistance was available, what other problems they were having, and so on. The rental housing counseling industry, I'm hoping, has been born because of the rentership crisis we had. And what it did was it taught us like 3 or 4 main things. One, the eviction moratorium, again, I don't know what everyone's views are, but had its downside. We have seen that in economic vacancy and affordable creeping up and increasing, depending on the jurisdiction to some extent, because it's about eviction laws. We did not see an eviction tsunami, but I attribute that very largely to both the fact that we had the emergency rental assistance program and that landlords actually stepped up and behaved largely pretty well, of course, never universal, and not only helped tenants get access to those programs, but actually encouraged them with their own programs not to be afraid to answer the door, to answer the phone call. So what did rental counseling teach us in Virginia, which went completely online? What we learned was rental counseling is way more complicated than simply helping a homeowner figuring out, a potential homeowner, how do you repair credit and get a down payment assistance. We found that tenants need to talk about food, access to other services, simply financial stability, issues in the household, mental health. So rental counseling is way more complicated, harder to do, more expensive, but almost essential in my view now. And so what I'd love to see us do is really spend a little bit of energy and time over the next 12 months figuring out how do we induce that to become something like a best practice for landlords to offer to tenants.
So one of the other things that sort of crept up in lots of states now is the idea of just cause evictions. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
I think it depends on how you define what is just cause. And that has been different in different states heretofore, or states that have experimented with those kinds of provisions. I think the important part that we're facing now, and this is also something else that has come out of COVID, it's not just the system for governing landlord-tenant relationships, which is done largely at the state and local level, and it really should be, but it's the enforcement mechanism that happens at the local courts. However, if the courts aren't enforcing it, which is really what's happening in a lot of jurisdictions, including right here in the District of Columbia, we're really going to struggle with how to make it through and ensure we have the financial resources to maintain this really important housing stock, not just for the renters of today, but for the renters of the future.
So it seems like the biggest solution to all of this is expanding the housing supply. If there's a lot more housing out there, there wouldn't be as many of these issues around price controls and things around rent. If you have more housing, there's going to be enough to meet the demand, and that will bring down prices, and it will, and provide more opportunities for people. So Ken, what does this mean for expanding the supply? How do we, with all these things going on, how do we induce developers to make more housing?
Well, I'm going to start with a favorite saying of mine: everybody wants to go to heaven, nobody wants to die. And that is, everybody says they want affordable housing, but at the end of the day, they say that, but they don't really want it. Not on my block, not in my section of town, not my district. And capital markets are very efficient. And if you look at a program like the low-income housing tax credit program, which I don't think gets enough credit. I mean, it's probably been one of the best social programs this country's ever had. But the reason it works is because when I get the credits, I know the rules. Here's what my rents are going to be. Here's what I have to do for the tenants. Everybody knows. So I think that one of the things that's happened is if you tell me there might be rent control and that I'm going to make it difficult to evict people, all of a sudden I've injected what I call uncertainties into the system. I really don't know, right? I don't know what you're going to allow me to charge rents a few years from now. So I think the best thing people can do, and again, some people have done it, is if you tell a developer, I want this to be affordable, here's what I'm going to do for taxes, and here's the process. So to the degree that people can just say, here are the things that have worked in terms of taxes, but most important of all, that here is a speedy process so you can get shovels in the ground. That the city says, before you even get here, we're going to give you a green light to do this project. And the problem is, again, I understand how local communities want to have a voice, but if you allow everybody to have a voice and weigh it all equally, then nothing gets done. Nothing gets done.
It makes me wonder, like, why y'all do it.
And like I said, you look at the tax credit program, when people say, oh, you know, the economics don't work, I said, we have a program that worked. The problem is it only goes up to 60%.
Right.
And that leaves out to school teachers, to policemen, what I call really working people, kind of get the shaft.
Yep.
And so we just need programs like that that attract capital and tell people what the rules are, and people will figure out a way to play.
So Andrea, tell us about, I imagine nonprofits have even more sort of challenges and opportunities in this space. And so how do you all go about trying to expand access to affordable housing?
At the core, nonprofits are experiencing the same thing that everyone else is, right? All of the same operational challenges, an inflationary environment, and tremendous uncertainty. In most cases, the nonprofit multifamily housing providers I work with are trying to provide deeper affordability and address inequities beyond just access to affordable housing. And so that layers on additional complexity. A year or so ago, we were happy to be early adopters and joiners on the White House's Resident-Centered Management Challenge. We spent a lot of time through COVID thinking about how to address some of the challenges that Shekhar talked about, and really saw a need to keep that conversation going, as you're talking about, and saying, you know, how can we adopt some of these practices? How can we go and continue to be resident-centered? And what we've seen is a lot of what's already been discussed, that there are very different experiences around the country in different markets in the degree to which we are back to normal, or still seeing tremendous economic pressures on renters and therefore on operators. And so what we see, we've collected data on about 100,000 households of groups participating in this cohort, and what we see is in markets like DC and to some extent Boston and Chicago, you still have really, really large rental arrears that are putting a lot of pressure on operators and obviously stress for residents. We also see that you continue to see racial inequities in who are having those challenges. I know overwhelmingly households led by Black women, and particularly Black women with children, are experiencing these challenges. But we also know they show up where there's rent burden, right? Even in a low-income housing tax credit program, which is incredibly efficient and does what it's supposed to do really well, we see people rent burdened and then, you know, racking up arrearages and problems that they're struggling to solve. I think we've got to recognize that we absolutely need to expand the tax credit program, and we need to allow it to do what it was built to do, and we need to resource ourselves well to go deeper in affordability. We need to provide more rental assistance, we need to provide more emergency safety nets, and we need to think up the income spectrum. It is not a silver bullet. It is a wildly successful program upon which we can model other solutions. The other thing we know is that in an affordable setting, resident services coordination has been really effective in connecting people to the things that they need. Not just the rental assistance, but the mental health, the access to food, the child care, the internet, all of those things. And as we think about expanding affordability, we've got to be thinking about preserving across the board, preserving the households, allowing people to stay in their home, preserving the buildings, the actual homes, and preserving the organizations that are here to do this work.
One of the things that was, I think, made the housing solutions during the pandemic work was the vast amount of housing assistance available to people. I think a lot of our problems with housing affordability would be solved if people were getting adequate housing assistance who need it. And how do we get there? Anyone?
Megan, we live in the housing arena always as though the pie is extremely limited and we have to cut it up in little tiny slices, and every one of us is competing with the other one. And as long as we do that, we will never come up with solutions that actually solve the problem. So first, we need to get out of this notion of there's only so many dollars. We can't have a middle-income housing tax credit program at the same time as a low-income housing tax credit, because then we are literally not solving the problem. But the second to me, which I think is critical, is we absolutely cannot accept that this is not the number one problem in the country. And we've got to start talking like that. Because there isn't a single city I go, a single mayor I meet, a single county commissioner who, within the first 15 minutes, knowing a little bit about my background, doesn't start talking about, you know what, we have a serious housing problem. And it's in Maine, it's in Rhode Island, it's in Mississippi, it's in places everywhere. So if that's true, why is it that Congress doesn't see that same sense of urgency? Is it purely ideological? Actually, housing was one of the, and is still one of the few bipartisan domestic subjects that people agree on. It's because we haven't linked it appropriately to all the other things that they care about as well.
The voucher type programs and rental subsidy programs are only as good as the housing supply we have available for people at that level. So we can talk about putting more money into Section 8, which we all support, and putting more money into emergency rental assistance, which we all support. If we do not have the supply, people are cannibalizing each other. And that's not fair. It creates enormous stress, particularly in low-income families. So we have to keep our eye on the prize, which is more supply, more supply. It's a long-term project. We can't just say, okay, give us some more vouchers and everything will be fine. That's not going to be a long-term strategy.
Look, if I wanted to build affordable housing, ask any developer all the people they have to talk to get a deal done. Even when the city says, I want to cooperate, I want to make it easy, I got to go to a lot of different places. So I think that the one thing that the industry needs to do is to start going to politicians and saying, you know, we need to reinvent government. Now, that's at the federal level, that ain't going to happen. But at the local level, just to tell people, if you looked at the cost of how much money you're spending to do this, and if you just combine this stuff, and like you said, if I gave somebody a card and say, look, this is your rent, food, you know, for the landlord's perspective, it's easy. Because, you know, I don't have to do any paperwork. Right. Here's the card.
It seems like local governments and nonprofits are sort of, and I agree with the bureaucracy part of it, but are having some of the more innovative ideas to try and solve some of these issues locally across the country. How do we harness that and try and turn that into things that work at a larger level?
Years ago at Fannie Mae, the city of Detroit had all these vacant houses. And I remember going with David to talk to the city and saying, you know, here's what New York City did. They were unaware and didn't want to do it because they had all these houses they had foreclosed on for property taxes. And anybody who bought the house would have to pay back the back taxes. And I said, that's crazy. I said, you know, the best thing you can do is give it away. And so what I've discovered a lot of times when I used to talk to people, they weren't aware of successes. And even when you told them about it, they didn't know how it worked. They were scared. And we live in, unfortunately, a climate today is we're in a very negative climate. Yeah. No one wants to, you know, if you have good news, it's almost like people don't want to hear it. And by the way, that's not just the right, it's also on the left. So you might have something on the right that says, oh, government is the problem. But on the left, all business is bad. And the thing is, there are things like, I used to hold up New York. New York City is not perfect, but if you look at the problems New York had in the 70s and the things they did to fix it, or when HUD unfortunately didn't last as long, when you look at what Renee Glover did with public housing in Atlanta. There have been successes, but the problem is that a lot of times those lessons learned are communicated, and even when people hear about it, oh, I heard about it, but no one says, here's the laws they had to pass, here's how it worked.
I was late getting here this morning because I was talking with a practitioner who's in the Midwest who said, there's a lot of creativity happening in the state where I am and a lot of will to solve the problems we're facing, but they feel like the state and localities feel like we're going as far as we can. We need the federal government to do something. And while it's really hard to get anything done, I think things like, expanding the tax credit, in providing some sort of flexibility or a relief valve somewhere for those state and local governments is a big part of scaling that innovation, because they need to feel like they can just take a breath and have a little bit of wiggle room in order to be creative.
Shekar, you started talking a little bit about this, about the interplay with other agencies other than just HUD and USDA and VA, but mostly HUD on the housing front. And so, for example, I know, DOT just came out with all the big announcement about these transit-oriented grants where you can get grants to build affordable housing near transit. I will tell you that a bunch of my members listened in on those DOT webinars they did for developers about how to do it. And then they came back to me with a bunch of questions. And so I reached out to DOT and I said, great, who are you working with at HUD? And they were like, HUD? This is our program. Why are we talking to HUD? Because they provide the financing for the housing that you're going to build near transit. But they literally weren't talking to each other. And we see this across the federal government. Honestly, we see it. What are ideas on how to link those things together? How do we get them to play nice in the same space?
Let me touch a little bit on the first thing that you pointed out, which is there's lots of different resources available today that were not available 2 years ago.
Right.
So first and foremost, if we keep thinking of the shrinking pie analogy again, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. Sadie's here with CPC and maybe somebody's here from Enterprise. And look, it's $15 billion that's going to get allocated over 7 years. And a lot of it is tied to what do we do in the electrification of affordable housing. It's down to, if you wanted to make this very scientific, it's how do I save every household living there, in addition to doing good things for the climate and carbon emissions and all of that, how do I save them $50 a month or $100 a month in utility bills? And how do I make the planet greener at the same time? It sort of sounds like a no-brainer. It's hard to do. Just try convincing a mortgage banker, Megan, that in addition to doing their wonderful financing with the GSEs, that they should be doing greenhouse reduction financing, right. That they need to learn how the credits work. But there's a lot of money now that's going to be available for the next few years that's tied to the electrification of residential housing, particularly affordable.
Sustainability seems to be sort of the biggest thing we're all talking about, right? That the government's talking about, and all these new things we have to do to try and make more resilient properties. Oftentimes, those can cost more upfront. They might save the resident money in the long term and save the building money in the long term, but upfront there can be higher costs for that. So, what are you all seeing? What are the challenges we're seeing in sort of the guidance around green, sustainability, all of that, and how is that impacting housing affordability or housing development now?
I think there's an opportunity for this to be a really good thing, but everybody's got to take a breath and be pretty thoughtful here, right? The need to become more sustainable, to decarbonize, to electrify, is coming, right? There are many jurisdictions that already have building performance standards and many more where they're coming. If you look at the map of the mayors and the governors who joined the White House's challenge, it's coming, and it's coming very quickly. So even if this doesn't feel important to you, it's going to be made important to you by those fines that are really sizable and come on pretty quickly over the next 5 years in a lot of these jurisdictions. And so I think thinking about where you can use these funds impactfully is really helpful, and it doesn't have to be the most innovative and shiny thing. I think we want to pilot those things. I think, we talk about successes. We really should applaud HUD. They're doing a pretty good job with that little green and resilient retrofit program at how quickly and thoughtfully they've executed, both to sort of incentivize innovation, but also do some of the low-hanging fruit for people that don't have the capacity. But I think thinking about this as a way to address preservation, too, of what do you do with some of these properties that really need work to become healthier and more sustainable. This could be a solution if at the local government level and the federal agency level we're thinking about how we layer this in. it cannot drive the whole transaction. It's got to fit in with the reality of capital markets and subsidy programs where you're talking about affordable. And we've got to build a workforce of people who are asset managers and developers who have the capacity to think about how to access these funds, because these folks are so overwhelmed. They don't have time to think about one more set of things right now. But also the people that can maintain and realize the promise of some of these technologies, because the last thing you want to do is spend time and money to do this and then not get the economic and health benefits of it on the back end.
And to Ken's earlier point, we have to continue to reduce barriers and evolve faster as we're seeing the green technologies evolve. 10, 15 years ago, all of that green money was tied to performance indicators, and we're all measuring all the success that we're having by the kilowatt or whatever. We know this technology works now. So, and to your point, I think HUD did a better job in this green retrofit program. Instead of making it complicated and creating this whole infrastructure around the tracking of this, let's just provide the resources to do it and make it simple.
Because one of the problems, if you look at the, Shaker mentioned iPhone, if you look in tech, you always have people causing disruptions, but you also have huge companies, the Microsoft, the Googles. You look at what's happening with artificial intelligence, they've got billions of dollars to spend. You get to real estate, I doubt there's no one in the country even has 5% of the multifamily housing.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there's anybody who's even
It's
got 5%. There's not we think of, related as big. It's very fragmented. So it's very hard to go to any one real estate company or to a developer and say, hey, I want you to sink a lot of money into research, development. I want you to be innovative. So how do you do that?
To Shekar's point of we're so used to operating in this scarcity mentality, I think we don't want to miss the moment to absolutely take those incremental steps forward, but also say we have a moment here where we can think about how to do this more equitably and how to actually move markets and do innovative things. So I think it's really important that we all flip the switch in our brains right now to stop being so scarce in how we think about this and be a little bit aspirational while still thinking about how do you just put one foot in front of another.
That's great. And I think it actually all boils down to Ken's point at the beginning about certainty. It's certainty for the developer, certainty for the renter, certainty for the communities. I think that's when we can come up with solutions that focus on that, I think that's where we're going to have more success.
Thank you for listening to this edition of Beyond Four Walls. You can visit the National Housing Conference at nhc.org. There you can learn more about affordable housing policies, affordability challenges throughout the nation on our Paycheck to Paycheck database, and explore membership in NHC for you or your organization. We appreciate your interest and look forward to working with you in the future. Until next time, I'm David Dworkin, NHC's President and CEO, wishing you a great day.